Now, of course, we're going to populate these folders step by step throughout this module. I want to start with the header for now, so with this toolbar at the top. And therefore, in the layout folder here, I will add a header.js file. And that will hold my header code. The header will also need some styling, so side by side to header.js, I will add a header.module CSS file. .module because I will use the built-in CSS modules support which modern React projects created with Create React App, which this setup is in the end, provide. So this CSS file will be needed. And speaking of that file, you find this header.module CSS file attached to this lecture, and you can simply replace yours with it or simply copy in all the provided styles, which are some styles I came up with to give this header the look you saw in the preview at the beginning of this module. Of course, you can also write your own styles if you prefer that. Now, in the header.js file, we want to have the JSX structure for our header. And therefore here I will export a header component function where we get some props. And of course, we'll also, export this function to make it available outside of this file because I will use it in a different file. And inside of this component function, I don't need complex logic or state or anything like that. Instead, there I will just return the JSX code for this header. And here I actually want to have two blocks of code. One block of code will be the header itself, so that toolbar. The second part will be the image below the header. Though we could also split that into two separate components if we wanted to. Here I will keep it in one component, but again, that is definitely a split you could also make. Have two components instead of one. Now here I will use a React fragment, so that built-in fragment component, and therefore I want to import React from React so that I can access React fragment. Alternatively, we of course just import fragment and use that directly as a component like this. And I'm using this fragment component as a wrapper because we must only have one root element returned here. That's true for any place where you use JSX. You must only have one root element. And in there, I actually want to have two sibling elements. A header, using the built-in header component, and then a div, which will hold the image. And again, that would be the two components you could also separate into separate component files and functions. Here, I'll keep it in one component though. Now, inside of the header here, which is a default HTML5 element, I'll have a H1 element where I'll say React Meals, which is just the name of this application I came up with. Of course, you can choose any name you want. And then, side by side to that, I want to have a button which will open the cart later. So for the moment, I'll just add a button with the name of cart like this. I will change this code in a couple of seconds or minutes though. Before we change that button though, let's have a look at that div. And in that div, I want to have an image. So the built-in image element. And here I'm providing an image to you, which you find attached as well. And I will add an assets folder in the source directory, so next to components, where this image will actually be stored in. So attached you find that meals JPEG file, and I will just copy that into that assets folder. This is an image which is provided locally as part of the React application. Now, how can we use that image here in this JSX file? Well, we can use this image in a way which could look strange when you first see it, but which is very easy to use once you're used to it. You can simply import images, and it's a bit like importing CSS files. It's not really a JavaScript feature, but instead, imports like that, so importing CSS files or importing images, is supported by this project setup which we're using here. And behind the scenes, the import is simply transformed to include the image in the finished application, which we could deploy to a server, and to generate a link to that image, which is then dynamically inserted in the generated code. So there's a lot of behind the scenes magic going on here. For us, we simply import meals image, though this name is up to you, from going up, assets, meals JPEG. And here the file extension matters, just as for CSS files, because this tells that build process that this is not a JavaScript file, but in this case an image file, and that it therefore should be transformed and injected appropriately behind the scenes. And then we can use this imported image as a source here by binding the source dynamically with curly braces and pointing at meals image. This is how you can include a local image. Of course, if this would be an image on some server and you simply had a URL to that image, you could just add that URL to some image. To some image.jpg. You could add that if you had such a URL. But here, since it's a local image, part of the project, we instead use that other approach. Now we can also add an alt text, a table full of delicious food, something like this. And with that, I got the general structure for this header component finished. Though there are things missing. For example, the styling. Here on the header component, on the header element, I want to add a class name. And since we added this CSS file, which uses CSS modules, we import classes from that module.css file. So from header module.css. And here, as a class name for the header, we should point at classes.header. Because in that CSS file, if you have a look at it, there is a header CSS class defined. And as you learned in the styling section, this is how you use CSS modules then. Now on that div, which holds the image, I'll also add a class name. And here it's classes main image written like this. Since it's a CSS class with a dash inside of it, we can't use the dot notation. And that's simply another CSS class defined in there. Now with that, the general header structure is finished. With that, we can now go to app.js, to our root component, and there we can import header from /components layout header like this. And then instead of this h2 tag here, I will use my header. And actually, I also don't want that div here anymore. Instead, here for the moment, I will just use a fragment, which I of course need to import from React. The React import itself is missing here because, as you learned, you can omit that in modern React projects like this one. You can always add it as well, though. You can always also import React from React, and it won't hurt either. Technically, it's required because of what JSX is transformed to behind the scenes, but in some project setups like this one, you can simply omit it. And with that, if you saved it, you should have that header here. And this is a good start. This is now our toolbar. Of course, the cart button in the header doesn't look at all like the button you saw in the preview though. And therefore, that's what we're going to work on next.